All right, y'all. So let me just share my screen real quick and we're gonna get at this. Oops, wrong screen share. Share screen, share this whole desktop. All right. And hopefully things should be kind of we should be good. Let me just make sure I close this. Great. Cool. So last class we started getting started with like React components. And you know, the whole vibe about React components is really essential for us to understand because this is the basic building block of all of the work that we're going to be doing building out these websites. And you know, you might still be a little confused as to like, when would I use a component? What are they really useful for? And that's okay. I want you to know that that's okay. Working with React takes time to understand both the syntax as well as the thought process behind making your applications as you start brainstorming them. And as any engineer knows, you spend a lot of time figuring out the plan of what you're trying to build before you actually start building. And so we'll definitely talk a lot more about planning a new application that you know you're going to use React for in some future sessions. But trust me, components are the thing that makes React work in general. So we're going to really get a lot of practice working with components. We're going to write a bunch of components on our own. And that's essentially what our next milestone will be, is our ability to write components of our own and essentially get those components to do the various things that we want them to do with relationship to our web page. So again, as a kind of recap, when we first started talking about components, we talked about how React creates a default component for us that is the app component. And the app component is located in our source/app.js file when we use the create React app toolchain. The app component's responsibility is to show some JSX on the screen that is kind of the default JSX for the create React app template when it first launches. It has the icon for the React, it has the React logo, it has some text and a variety of styles kind of connected to it already to make it look and appear pretty cool and let us know that we're ready to work on some React code ourselves. The app component is our first look at a component. And I talked to y'all a little bit last session about how there's a couple of different responsibilities that components have. The first is the main responsibilities that components have is to return some amount of JSX that is going to be rendered eventually on the browser, on the actual web page that we're going to be looking at. The JSX, right, is a JavaScript syntax for React that is related to different elements that are JavaScript elements that we can manipulate, but translate to HTML elements as they get rendered on the screen. So everything that you would typically expect to work with in an HTML context, divs and headers and headings and anchors and buttons and any HTML element, you name it, there's a JavaScript intrinsic element that was created to function with JSX in React. And we use those elements in our JavaScript files, right? So remember, this app component is located in a file called app.js in our source folder, right? We use those JavaScript files to be very specific with creating the components that we want to show on the screen. And the JSX allows us to merge the JavaScript-like code that we want to write with these elements that are our visual components and the things that would eventually be put onto the screen for our users. So that's really the main job a component has, is to show that JSX, define the JSX, and eventually render it on the screen in certain capacities. We talked a lot about how these files work together to make that happen. And when we looked at the React docs, we saw that it's important at a certain point in time for the React applications to specifically take a component and render it specifically onto the actual DOM. And the way it does that is by calling a specific method that comes in the React library, in the React DOM library, specifically called render. And that method, that function, is located in our index.js file. And so we talked about how in this index.js file, we call this React DOM.render function, and we pass one component into it to eventually get rendered on the screen. Now, we could put any component in here. We could actually put a set of components in here, right? If I wanted to create an entirely new application, I could just create a bunch of different elements and pass them in here to get rendered eventually. But it is a little less easy to read and understand that. So what we do is we package groups of codes that have specific responsibilities into these components. So, and a component is really a modular bit of code that is responsible for returning and rendering some JSX. Here's a different look at the app component. This one is a little bit different, right? The main responsibility of this component is to eventually just decide, hey, what do I want the user to see? Is it going to be some intrinsic element like the header or the div, or is it going to be like a custom component element that I've created? And so we talked about creating our own components, and there's a couple steps that go into that. The first is we define the component, and the second is to return some JSX from that particular component. The third is to make sure that we either export it or import it if we're importing a specific component. And so here's an example of us exporting the app component, which eventually gets imported in the index.js here at the top. But also in that app component, we see an example of us importing a custom component. So here's us importing another component that we created into our application so that we can make use of it as part of the definition of the app component. So even though we're only returning one component here and we called it app, this app component is returning some other components that are each responsible for presenting their own bit of information in the form of JSX. And that is how components kind of work together, is we would define components that return or render other components. And in doing so, those components now are part of, those components get a very special relationship. The component that is the main component that is returning or rendering other components becomes what we call in this case a parent component, right? The app is the parent component to the hello and the message component, as well as these other elements, because the app is the one that is eventually going to render them. If we were to track kind of like if we were to run this application and look at the DOM, right? Remember the DOM, the document object model, returns JavaScript in the form of a tree. So if we were to think about how this tree-like structure would be created, the index.js says, hey, the React DOM function says, okay, take this app component and render it into our HTML under this ID root. When it does that, it takes the app component that we defined and it renders it as HTML. The HTML will then have a div, have a header, and inside the header, there's going to be whatever HTML eventually gets returned from these two components. And so the hello component really is just almost like a placeholder that we use to actually make reference to this bit of JSX, this div with the header and with the heading, excuse me. I always get those confused. I keep always mess up calling headings, like headings and headers. It's all types of confusion. But back to what I was saying is that the hello component is really just responsible for returning some information. That's really all it's doing. And the app component is responsible for making sure that the hello component eventually gets rendered. Same thing with the message component. So certain components will be the parent component of other components. And to be a parent component means that you're the component that is responsible for returning and rendering that other custom component. These custom components we would call children. So this hello component is a child of the app component. The message component is also a child of the app component as well. I don't know why Slack started tweaking on me. Cool. So the last thing we talked about before we wrapped the last session was that there's a couple different types of ways to define components. And when we first use the create React app boilerplate, we get introduced to a functional component. A functional component is a very lightweight syntax of component definition that requires you to only define a function as define a component as a function. To do that, you use the function keyword, name the component, name the function what you would eventually name the component, and open up the parentheses and curly braces like you would do a regular JavaScript function. And inside, you just return what is the JSX that you want this component to return. And JSX, again, is allowing us to make use of this HTML-like syntax, but remember, this is not HTML, this is JavaScript that's getting returned. And those functional components are very useful. There's a lot that the reason we use them is because they're so lightweight. There's not too much inside of this file that is necessary to create it. You just use the function keyword and you could go ahead. All of these other things are just imported because we chose to, rather than because they were related to us creating a functional component. But there's another type of component that we started talking about last class, and that is a class-based component. And class-based components do similar things to what a functional component is doing in the basic sense of, one, this component's job, the most important thing that this component has to do is return some JSX that is eventually going to be shown on the browser. The syntax between a class-based component and a functional component is the big difference, is one of the big differences, I should say. The syntax of a functional component is a little lightweight. All you really do is return some JSX. But with a class-based component, you define your component as a class. So I want to just make a note that what we're really doing here is creating objects out of our components. We're making our components objects. And in JavaScript, objects are very specific. They have a lot of significance in JavaScript because unlike a lot of other languages, JavaScript treats a lot of things as objects. It treats, not only does it treat the variables that we consider as objects, not only is there's also an object data type that we can use in JavaScript. So remember, we could create I could create an object called, let's just call it my obj for right now, right? Anything with these curly braces becomes an object, and as objects in JavaScript allow us to pass data as like key value pairs when we define the JavaScript actual data type as an object. But JavaScript treats a lot of different things that you might not expect as objects, like functions are treated as objects in JavaScript, which is interesting in that we can, because they're treated like objects, we can pass the data from a function we could pass data from a function as if we're passing a regular variable. And that makes it really interesting in ways that you can define a function and then pass that function into another function as an argument that it can be called later. And that becomes really interesting in certain use cases in React that we'll see in a bit. But the big point I'm trying to make is that our components need to be structured as JavaScript objects, whether we're using functions, which naturally do that because that's how JavaScript works, or with a class is also another type of object that is a little bit more robust in that it allows for you to make use of certain predefined methods and functions that are just a part of what it means for an object to be a class, part of a class. And so when you work with classes in any other programming language, you learn about how classes are like the blueprint for certain objects, right? We create new objects out of the blueprint of a class. So if I had a class called car, I could create a Tesla object that is part of the car class, right? The car would define what does it mean for something to be a car, and I can create new instances of the car class and save those as variables that would be save those as variables that have their own bit of data saved into them, and it may be instantiated with different parameters or whatnot. But in the React sense, classes are treated the same way, but we're using a specific class to start our, I guess, to draw our information from. Essentially, when we're working with React classes, we're using a base, what we call a base class, that is the React component class, base class. This component, this React dot component, comes from the React library, and it allows for us to create a new class that will be its own React component, for lack of better words. So a class-based component is interesting in that it's becoming derived from a specific object that's already defined in the React library that's called a component. And a component in the React library has a very specific definition and structure and things that it needs to implement, as well as other interesting functions and variables that are just a part of what the React library creators made into this particular class, this component class. So I say all that to say that the syntax for creating this class-based component is, of course, very different than the functional component. We're forced to import the React from the React library. And to do that, we have this line here, import React from React. But then we're also forced to create a definition of a class-based component in this way, where we use the class keyword, name our component, and we use this interesting keyword extends, and then we pass this React.component. Or another way that you might see this written in other documentation is because we're getting this component as an object out of the React library, you see the React.component. So basically what we're saying here is get the component object from this React library, right? We've seen this dot with object syntaxes referring to a property off of another object. Sometimes when we're importing things, and instead of having to do it like this, what you might see people do is, instead of importing the whole React library, you might see somebody say import component, which this syntax here is a JavaScript destructuring syntax that basically says, take the object that comes back from the React library, and I want to get the component variable. I want to get the component variable off of that particular object that comes back. So this curly brace with this keyword inside of this is called object destructuring in JavaScript. So when we do it like this, we don't actually have to bring in the whole React library. We can just say extends component, because we're getting specifically the component part of the React library back. So sometimes you'll see people define their classes like this. Naturally, it's the same thing as just saying, hey, I want the component from the React library, which we're doing here. So I'll just leave it like this so that y'all understand that. I just wanted y'all to see that that's another way of writing that syntax that might come up as you're doing your own research or your own review of certain things. Classes, like I was just mentioning, have access to certain properties and functions and methods that were predefined based on this base class that they are getting derived from the React.component. Specifically, there are a couple of methods and functions that a class is required to implement. And then there's some that are just optional ones that you can use. So the most important function that all class-based components need to create is this render function, which is a function that's basically tells this component, hey, what JSX am I going to return when I have to be rendered? When someone renders this message component, what ends up being rendered? And this render function is responsible for setting those things. Part of what I mentioned last session was, if you really look at this render function syntax, and it's just a function that's returning some JSX, this in and of itself is basically what a functional component is doing. Functional component is not, this is not called render, this is called the name of the component, and it's returning some JSX. It's the same thing that this render function is doing. So when you think about it, class-based components and functional components have a similar structure in that they have to return this JSX from some function. In a class-based component, that function is already created for you and defined for you. It's called render. So you need to say render and then return what you want to return. With a functional component, defining the function is the job that you take when you are creating a functional component. So similar to the functional component, the class-based component has to do some declaration and definition and declaration, right? We have to declare that we're going to create this new class. We're defining what that component is going to be responsible for returning and rendering. And then we can export it to be used elsewhere and then import it to be used elsewhere as well. Just the same way that we would do with these other functional components. The big thing that makes a class-based component something worthwhile is the fact that it has these different methods that are already a part of it, because it's a class, and also a class that's extending from the React component-based class. One of those functions that we talked about last session was the constructor. The constructor you could think of like you would normally think of in any other kind of object-oriented programming environment, is the first function that this class is going to call when it's eventually being rendered onto our browser. So when this class is actually being created, first function it calls is this constructor, and then eventually it calls our render function. The beautiful thing about having a function like the constructor is that you can use it to instantiate and initialize certain aspects of data, as well as run certain functions that you need to run prior to rendering the component. You can do some of that with a functional component, but with a functional component, everything kind of just gets returned as it gets returned. But with a class-based component, there's other methods that we call lifecycle methods that are part of a class that allow for you to segment what's happening, segment basically at what points in time or what kind of stage of development or stage of creation is your component in over time. And so the constructor clearly will let you know, hey, I'm at the first stage of being created, my constructor function is running. Then eventually your render function gets run and you can say, hey, I'm at the render stage of my life cycle, et cetera, et cetera. So just wanted to recap these like component kind of basics and the fundamentals of what it means for us to be creating these components. And again, we were looking at the React docs a lot. There's a lot of helpful information at the reactjs.org website. If you go to docs, it talks all about these things in these first couple of sections. Today, we're going to continue on and keep talking about components a little bit more, and also start talking about props, which is a very necessary aspect of working with components that you are probably going to be grateful that you know as you start building out components of your own. So let's talk about that and keep building out some of these custom components and working with them on our own. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to switch gears a little bit and pull up this application that's running, and I am going to stop this. Oh, I guess the server was running, so I could have just went to localhost, but nonetheless, I'm just going to restart this particular server. So I'm just going to run npm start in the terminal to start the React development server. And then in doing that, I'm going to switch back to this Google Chrome tab so that eventually it opens up a new tab for me when the server is fully deployed. And we're going to just keep making a little bit of changes to this application to get a better sense of what's going on with regard to working with this particular project. So I open in this browser, but I want to open it in. I don't want to use this one. I use this one. So cool. I'm gonna go to localhost 3000, and we get presented with this alert that says, "Hey, we're in the constructor." That's because inside of this code, I put this console log as well as this alert that says we're in the constructor, just to prove the point that the constructor runs first. Clearly, we're not seeing anything rendered on the screen, but as soon as I press OK, we get this React app kind of rendered on our screen. So that's pretty cool. But what I want to do is continue making some changes to this application and keep working with these components to do so. So first thing I want to do is just make a couple changes, and in order to do that, I'm going to make some more components, and then we'll talk a little bit about how we can make these things work a little bit better for us. So first things first, I'm going to go back to this application. Again, I think all of the source code for this as of right now is updated in on this repo, components on my repo in GitHub. So if you wanted to take a look at the actual code that I'm using, you could just go and either clone the repo or just look through all the files, and I'll keep it updated after this lesson as well. So I just wanted to touch on that. But first thing I'm going to do is inside of here, I'm going to just kind of reset a little bit. You know, I got a couple things going on with some old components. So instead of that, I'm going to just clean up the code a little bit. So I'm not using this hello component in this index.js. I'm only rendering the app. So I'm going to just delete some stuff that doesn't need to be there. So save this. And then in our app, I'm going to really kind of just start messing around in this component a little bit. And so we have this hello component that we're rendering in the app.js, as well as our message component. The hello component says, yo, we hacking on React. And I think it also says something probably around to the effect of that making a big change. So let's just take a look at it. So the hello component is saying, yo, we hacking on React, making a big change. I'm going to just change this up to just say hello. So we're kind of just clear, like this is coming from the hello component. I'm just going to say hello. I want to see this server reload eventually with my changes, but my internet might be getting the best of me. So I'm just refresh. Oh, and I can get rid of those alerts. So hello component clearly is just saying hello. And now I want to kind of just make some changes to this message component, which is the other component being rendered in the app.js right now. So inside of this message component, I want to, I'm just gonna comment out the code that I have in the constructor as a default. And then here in the return, I'm going to say, here is a message I want to render. Here is the message I want to render. Sorry, I'm becoming a poet laureate over here. So I'm gonna say save this and save the app, and I am cool. I got this hello component saying hello, and I got this here is the message I want to render. Earlier, I was saying the thing about how when we think about how a tree is structured and with the ways that components are being called, that they kind of get added in this tree-like structure. So I'm just going to inspect this page real quick so that I can show you that a little bit more specifically. So inside of this elements, we're looking at the HTML that is coming back from inside of this public folder, the index.html that's here. This index.html is a template that the Create React app uses to eventually insert using JavaScript. It inserts all the JavaScript code that we eventually would be building from our JavaScript files that are inside of our source directory. So this template HTML is really here so that it gets changed over time. And the way it does that is it creates this div with the ID of root. That is what the index.js says, hey, React DOM, I want you to render a new React app into this div called root. So find this element that I call root and then insert, basically use whatever React DOM magic you have to render the HTML that's being defined from these various components that we are mentioning here. More specifically, the one we care about the most is this app component. The React.strict mode is a very specific kind of React, Create React app creates this React strict mode for us as some best practices in React for right now. You don't got to worry about it too much, but just remember that we're rendering this app component is the custom component that we created and we're rendering here. So index.js says, hey, grab that root element inside of the HTML file here, this div that's currently empty. And I want you to render these components, the actual HTML from these components into this particular div. And that's exactly what happens, right? So if we open up our HTML template, we know this is the same HTML template because we could see all of the various things we define in the head are here, as well as if we open up the body, all of those other elements are there as well. So here we see this div ID root. And unlike in a template file, this is no longer empty. There's a couple of new elements that have been rendered underneath them as we would say children of this particular element, right? If we were looking at this as a tree, remember that the JavaScript DOM presents information as a tree, right? So I'm just looking at the HTML DOM again to just make sure that we understand what I'm saying here. The DOM is a tree of objects and elements that are being derived from the root HTML element. So this is the actual HTML DOM. This is how the actual DOM works and how regular JavaScript would connect to the HTML DOM. The React DOM is a specific JavaScript interface that sits on top of this HTML DOM. And again, what it's doing is redefining how we work with the DOM by way of using JavaScript and React. So the actual DOM exists, which is why we're seeing something here. But the React DOM does something specific with this div called root, which it makes this root element our new parent component of all the React application components we're defining. And so inside of this root div is when we start seeing some of these other components become rendered. And just like how the HTML DOM, you see from whatever the root element is, it's like kind of like this tree structure. That's exactly what's going on with the React DOM within this app structure, within the root, the root that we created out of the render function from the index.js. The app.js, eventually all of this JSX becomes rendered as HTML. So we see this div with the class name, and class name is a JavaScript keyword. Div class name app here turns into a div with the HTML class app. And inside that, we see a header element. That header element is this JSX element here with originally it had the class name app header, but that becomes just passed on to the HTML. That header has some elements inside of it. So the header opens and closes, and inside of it, we see our two custom elements. So if I open up the header, I would expect to see those custom elements that are being created from our component. So remember, our hello component is really only doing something simple. It's returning a div that says hello, and the message component is doing something similar. And that's exactly what we see here, right? So again, all of this is following both the regular DOM as well as the React DOM in the sense of working as a tree. But now that we kind of understand that a little bit, let's keep talking about what we can do with these components now that we have them defined. So cool. So clearly I have a message component, right? And this message component, you might think, this is pretty cool. We can pass some text in here and the text will show up inside of the application. So if I were to go back to this app.js and I'm like, cool, like this structure is great. I'm really digging it. Maybe instead of the hello component being so similar to the message component, I'm gonna just change it from a div to an H3. And so that just gives this a little bit more of a difference from this component here. But let's say now I'm like, oh, bet, like, what if I want to have multiple messages that come back, right? Well, one of the cool things about it being a component is instead of having to define all that all over again, I can just call this component as many times as I want. So I say boom, 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 right? And all it's going to do is print this thing 5 times. So I can use the components I can use the fact that I've created this component to specifically call this block of code as many times as I want, both inside of this file as well as in any file that I end up importing this component into, which is what makes components really helpful, is that they're reusable. So once you define it once, if you need that same block of code again, you can easily add that component into another file or into another component that's rendering. And that is one of the things that makes React components, working with those components, really interesting. So cool. So I got 5 messages, but this isn't really helpful, right? What if how would I go about changing this up so that, you know, maybe this message I want to say this, or this one I want to say something different? How could I pass some data into the component to allow it to know some information that it should use when it decides to render? Because currently, if we look at this message component, there's not really any space for us to like where would we like get information that changes this, right? And says, oh, like instead of this div being this, maybe it's something else. And that's exactly that's a situation of wanting to pass data into a component is where props comes in. And props is a very specific React keyword and React feature that we use to pass data into our components. So in order to pass data into your components, you use props. But in order to define props, you have to remember one very special thing. You can only pass props from a parent component into a child component. The only time you can pass props is when you are in the parent component's definition and you are looking at a child component and you're saying, okay, boom, I want that child component to show this prop. So what do I mean by that? Well, here we have our message component, right? And we want our message component to end up being a little bit more unique than this, right? We want to be able to pass some data into our message component and tell it to say something specific as the message. So what I mean by being in the parent component is what component is rendering this component that we want to pass the props into. So we need to be in whatever component is rendering our message component. And the only component that's doing that right now is our app component, right? You know a component is rendering another component when you see one that is being imported or something, or more specifically, inside of the return or in the render function, if we're looking at a class-based component, that we're calling the component as an element, right? This is a sign that this component is a parent component to this component. Just like what we saw with the inspector, right? The app component is the container that is holding all of this custom JSX code. So again, a parent component is whatever component is responsible for creating and for basically returning that another component in its render function. So our app component is the parent component to our hello component, as well as the message component, and all 5 of these message components. So cool. Step 1 of using props is complete. We are able to identify which component is able to pass props. The one that's the parent component is the one that can define the prop. So that's the second step, is to actually define the prop. So props are props are basically like different data and attributes that you can pass into into a customized component. So for instance, we have this message component, right? And it would be real cool if instead of just the message component rendering this like very static text here, instead of it doing that, maybe we can pass some data to our component. Like maybe I could do something like, say, like content, and content for this component might be a string that I pass into it and say something like, this is a test, right? And maybe each of these messages can just receive some content that I can pass into it. and then eventually use in a specific way here in this function. And that's exactly what props allow us to do. Matter of fact, what we just did was create a new prop called content. So props are super easy to work with and in React. You basically get an opportunity to define whatever you want the prop to be called. You can think of it like a variable that you can use as, you could call whatever you want. So I could call this content, I could call this text, I could call this data, I could call it whatever I want. So long as it doesn't conflict with another existing prop name, I should be cool. And because clearly there's been no other props established on this custom component, I think I'm cool to say content here. So when you're creating a prop, the first thing you want to do is make sure you give the prop a name that you can relate it to. The second thing that all props need is to be passed an object as data. So strings are clearly an object. Numbers are an object, but in JavaScript, in the syntax of working with React, if I wanted to pass an object, typically what you'll see people do with their props is they wrap it in curly braces. So for things like strings, you don't have to wrap it with curly braces, but most times when you're passing another object in, you have to wrap it in a curly brace like this. So you're saying this object, and then you can define whatever the object is. So if it was a number, I could pass a number. If it was a function, I could pass another function in here. If it was an array, I could pass the array in here. Whatever other data type or object I want to use, I could call within these curly braces. And we'll see some of that as we do some more practice. But for now, I'm going to use the strings. You know, it kind of can be a little confusing that, oh, with strings, I don't need the curly braces, but I think you could use them. We could test that. Let's test that. But I'm gonna just do it to show you all how props work. I'm gonna just use it in the way I know it works. So I'm not breaking stuff before y'all get the understanding. Right now, we created a prop called content, and now we're gonna pass some content inside of it. So I'm gonna say passing data from props. So now our message component, because of this step I just took of writing this, creating a new prop called content, and passing it some data, I'm now able to make reference to that prop inside of our message component. But before I go over there, I just want to make sure that y'all see how the syntax works. Each component that we create as a custom component has an opening little caret and then a closing little caret. Sometimes I collectively call these things the peace signs, you know, left sign, right sign, peace signs. But so each component kind of gets defined like this, right? And like when we're actually putting them in a return in our render statement, right? We're saying, hey, you know, I want to pass this message component. I want this message component to actually get rendered. Props get created after the name of the component, right? And before the closing tag. So anywhere in between the name of the component and the closing tag of that component is where you can define a prop. So like you see, I have a content is like inside, this whole thing is inside of this tag. So I want you all to just be aware of that syntax when you're defining props. And so we'll see some more examples of, you know, making some more props with some other components in a second. But right now I'm passing this, I've created a new prop called content. Like I said, we just define a prop very easily. You just say whatever the name of the prop is you want it to have. Then you set it equal to some data. For strings, you can just use the strings. For other objects, you have to pass it in curly braces. We'll see in a second if actually using curly braces still works with the string. And in which case, I would just recommend you use just curly braces, but we'll see that in a second. But we now have a prop that we define called content inside of our message component. So I'm going to use this class-based component to show us how we use props within this class-based component. And then we'll also play around and use props in our other components, our functional components, as we play with those too. So within a class-based component, props get passed directly into the class. So that's one of the really cool things about it. So a class-based component automatically will just receive its props the thing you have to do is make sure that within whatever functions inside of the class that you want to make use of the props, you specify that you want to bring in props, basically. So if I wanted to bring in props, like the props that this message component has defined in the constructor, I would just say props and say, okay, hey, the constructor, I want you to receive these props from the message component, and then we can make use of them inside of our constructor. So maybe what I might want to do is, first thing is with the constructor functions, it's important to just call super, and you can pass your props into your super function. This is just kind of a default syntax for when you create a new constructor. You'll see this syntax whenever you'll see people working with classes. Again, the super function is just the function that initializes the base component that you derived your component, your class from. The super function is a function that initializes the base class of whatever class you've created. And in this case, we're initializing the React.component base class so that our message component is initialized properly with all of the right functions and stuff working the way we would expect them to. But now that I have props being passed into this constructor function, so I can easily pass that same variable props into the super function. I could also do something simple like console log the props. So let's just do that. Oops. Let's just do that and see what comes back in our message component. So nothing's changed in our app.js, but if we inspect this now and go to the JavaScript console, we see our, hey, I'm in the constructor console log from the hello.js. And then inside of the console, we're seeing a couple different objects get printed. And this object that's getting printed is our prop object. I'm not immediately sure why it's being called so many times, but I do know that what we're seeing here clearly is an object that contains our props. And the prop it contains, as you can see, is this content that we had defined earlier. So when you pass your props, it doesn't matter what you name it, so long as you remember the name, whatever the data is that you named it as is going to be passed into the component. So with that being said, that means now our render function can also make use of props. And by making use of props here, we can very easily oh, I know why I wasn't printing the right way. We can very easily now pass this information into our components as it's rendering. So the props function, the props are passed directly into our classes. So we can make use of it like this in this syntax, like I just showed you. But part of what makes classes very interesting is that you can call props very specifically on your class-based component. So inside of this console log, inside of the constructor, instead of doing it like I was doing it here, I'm going to show you how the other way that you would make reference to props inside of a class-based component is you would use a very specific keyword called this. You say this, and you say dot props. Whoops, props, right? And so this is a JavaScript keyword that refers to whatever instance of this class are we looking at. So right now, if you look at our app.js, we have 5 instances of our class message. So this keyword is going to refer to whatever particular instance we are in. So this particular instance is this message. This particular instance is another one. This is another one. I know it's not it's not highlighting OD well. This one is one, this one is two, this one is another one, this one's another one, so on and so forth. So the reason it was printing all of these is because it was printing from inside of all of the message components, right? Our message component before was saying, hey, just print the props. But now with by saying this dot props, it's gonna know very specifically which message object are we talking about. And it's while this console log being a part of the constructor is still gonna run, what the logic of this dot props does is it allows us to be a little bit more specific about what is being returned from, like which instance are we talking about when we're interacting with the props. So when I save this, as you can see, the oops, oh man, I'm messing it up. Inside of the man, this is not going the right way for me right now. Inside of the constructor is the only place where you have to pass props like this. I'm sorry, y'all. I don't want to make it more confusing than it has to be. Inside of the constructor is the only place where you have to refer to props in this fashion, where you pass props into the function and et cetera, et cetera. But inside of the render function, right? So clearly we saw that we were passing the prop into this function. Inside of the render function is where we can see more of the props that are being passed specifically from this dot props situation. So as you can see here, now that I kind of console locked, I commented out the constructor because we weren't really needing it. I was just using it to show you all that particular instance method. But inside of this render function, you can see now I'm doing a console log of this dot props, right? And so this is what I mean when I say that the props are passed directly into the class. Clearly now I don't have to make use of props here like this, but I can get a reference to it by using this dot props. And by calling that inside of these 5 different messages, there's 5 different things that print, and only one of them is saying, hey, I have this content prop. All of the other ones are just empty objects. So this is proving the point that each instance of our message object, our message class is different, right? This first one, if we look back at the app.js, I only defined props on one of them. It was this first one, right? If I maybe add this prop to another one, like this third one, and maybe change this from saying pass the data from props to testing on another component, or I should say another instance, right? So when this reloads, you can see, let me just refresh this. When this reloads, you can see clearly that we're passing the props into 2 of those components now. And each of those components have different props. The first one, its prop, while the name of the prop is the same, right? Content is the same. This instance is different data than this instance. And so, yeah, that's how props work, in the sense that we can pass whatever data we want into whatever instance of a component we want and make reference to it inside of that component. So now what I can do is very interesting is clearly I can make use of this dot props inside of our render function. And this dot props inside of the render function is going to allow me to do some very specific stuff in JavaScript to make this return statement a little bit more interesting, right? So instead of returning this very simple div, what I can do now is maybe replace what's inside of this div in the text-based sense with whatever is the text inside of this dot props as content. So remember, this is an object, content, right? This is an object, and inside of the object, there's a specific key called content that has this data that's the string. So like we talked about earlier, the syntax we use when we're dealing with objects that, and we want to specifically specify a specific property from the object, is the dot syntax. So if I wanted to make a reference to the content that's coming back from this dot props, I could say this dot props dot content, right? And when I save this, you can see it's going to clearly just print whether or not I have some props there. If I do, it's going to print the string. Otherwise, it's going to say it's undefined, right? And for some of those, we know it's undefined because it wasn't, we didn't pass those props to all of these particular components. So here's an interesting thing. Now I know I can use this .props.content as a means of getting the data back from that I passed into my component as props. So in order to make a reference to it, I'm gonna want to make sure that this div either returns the, I want this div to return this content. So this is where these components being JavaScript becomes very helpful, because now we can use some JavaScript syntax to pass this data from here into this JavaScript expression here. So to do that, all I have to do is make sure when I'm passing JavaScript expressions inside of some JSX and it's like nested like this, what I want to do is open some curly braces. Oops. Open some curly braces like this. And then inside of here, I can put some JavaScript expressions, right? I could put a function call if I want to do that. We'll see some of that later on. I can put, I can put a function call. I could put some variable logic. I could put a string if I want to. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say this.props.content. So I'm just going to say take whatever data is in this.props.content, and that's what's going to be returned basically as a part of this expression. So when I do that, what we're going to see is some of these components, clearly some components went away, but then the two components that have props are still showing up. We see passing data from props, testing on another instance. Well, that's cool, right? Now I got this message to be a little bit more unique. It's passing the data that I passed into it as props. So the content is now changing what is showing up from the message. But in the process, we kind of lost 3 of those messages. And the reason why is because the way that this div is being returned is it's saying, hey, return this.props.content. But like we clearly just saw, in certain moments, this.props.content is undefined. So clearly React did something interesting. When this was undefined, it didn't throw an error. It didn't give us any warning. It didn't tell us anything like that. All it did was say, hey, I can't actually render that component that you said. I can't render a component that has this thing undefined. So you know what? I'm going to just assume that you don't want me to render this at all. So I'm not going to render it. And so that's what took it away from the from us seeing it. So instead, what we're going to do now, right, is like, because that's not necessarily what we want. We don't want to, see the content, see these messages go away. Maybe we do want these 3 messages to have something like a default message or some sort. Like if I pass the content, then I can if I pass the content, then I can see it, what I pass. Otherwise, if I don't, maybe there's just a generic message that gets shown up. So again, we can make that happen by way of using JavaScript, right? That's kind of sounds like a conditional, right? If we have some content, maybe I want to return something else. I want to return something else. And that's exactly what we can do using this JavaScript, using the fact that this is all JavaScript. So I'm going to do it the simple way. I'm just going to put an if else block in there. So the condition, let's just say the condition is that this.props.content exists. So if I want to test that a variable exists, I could just pass the name of the data in here. So this would be the same as saying, is this.props.content equal to undefined or not? If this comes back, if there is a this.props.content, this will be true. Otherwise, if it's undefined, it's going to say no, it's undefined. So there is no this.props.content. So we're going to go into the else. So I'm just going to move this return statement for this.props.content up. And in the else statement, I'm going to return something else. I'm just going to say div, and inside of here, I'm going to say this is a default message. So what's going on here is inside of this render function, we have a if else statement as a return. Instead of just a simple return statement, we have kind of some conditional logic going on here. We're saying if we have some data that we call content that's coming back, return whatever's in the content. Otherwise, just return a default kind of message inside of this element with a div. So cool. So if I save this now, inside of my component, you can see we get back our five strings. For some of them that have data that's defined as props, have that as their message. Otherwise, we have this default message. This is a default message. So then if I go back to the app.js and I pass some more content, pass some more props into this. So I say content equals another instance with props, testing on another instance, and I'll just add content to all of them. One more time. Last one. I go back. So clearly all of these messages are now unique and they have their own content. And if we look at the console log, we can see all those this.props.content console logs are being commented here. So cool. Now with that, just that in and of itself, I now know that I can create a component and pass data into it pretty simply. The valuable thing about props is being able to pass this data. You can define a data and set it equal to some object and then pass it into the component to be received as props. And in a class-based component, you can use the this.props keyword inside of your render function to refer to the specific props that you're talking about. You can use props in your other functions, like I was trying to show you, but it was getting a little messed up in my example. But in the other functions that are outside of your render function, you it's specifically in your constructor, you have to pass props into the constructor like this so that it knows that you are making reference to props. You can't call this.props inside of a constructor. But in a render function, you can call this.props. And yeah, so the interesting thing is clearly the valuable thing about passing the data is that I can make use of it, but it also introduced us to this very interesting thing about React too, which is that I can use conditionals to show one thing or another thing in certain moments. This is our first example of what we call in React conditional rendering. Here I'm basically using a conditional to determine what am I actually going to render on the screen for the viewer and for the user. And conditional rendering is a huge part of React. We use conditionals like this to return different things in different contexts all of the time. So it's kind of cool that we get to see a little lightweight example of this right now as we're rendering this message component. And so, so cool. I want to do another example of using props and just kind of wrap our head around this one more time in a different kind of example. Before I do that, I did want to test this stuff and just see if I pass this wrapped in curly braces. Okay, yeah, cool. So the string doesn't necessarily require you to wrap things with curly braces, but I would, as a rule of thumb for y'all to just make your life easier, I would just wrap your props with curly braces. It's just a good thing to know, okay, let me just wrap my props that I'm defining with curly braces so that I can ensure that I'm passing an object into the component as props. So I'm just gonna clean us up and add those curly braces to just make sure that this is kind of cleaned up to the degree that I want it to be before I push it up to GitHub. And cool. So got this message component. We have this prop called content. Again, props are pretty simple and straightforward. You just define the name of the prop, pass some data in a curly brace based on what you want the data to be. And then you can make use of that data inside of the component. the biggest rule of thumb you have to keep in mind with props is that in order to create props, you don't create props inside of the component. You create props from the component that is rendering your component, the other component. So props are created at the moment of a component being rendered. So when this message gets rendered, I'm saying, hey, from my app component, I'm saying, hey, when I'm rendering this message component, I'm going to pass some data called content into it. So that's just something you got to remember, is that the parent component is the one that passes the props. And this process of creating a component and passing prop, or defining a prop in that another child component is going to use, we call passing props. So when you hear someone say, you have to pass props into that component, they're meaning go to wherever the parent is defining this component and set up some props as data that you want to pass into this component so that it can make use of it the entire way through, right? It can say, hey, in the constructor, I can make use of these props. Hey, in the render, I can make use of these props and do whatever I want to do with it very specifically. So cool. There's a good example of that. So what I'm going to do is now I'm just trying to think of another lightweight example I can do to show you this. But I guess one thing I'll do right now is So one thing I do want to say, I don't have like a good example of, why I would use this right now for this specific lightweight component, but you can pass multiple props into a component. The only thing is, in order to pass multiple props, you just want to make sure that you give the next prop a specific name that's not the same one as this one. So if I wanted to pass another prop and say it was called, maybe it's called sender, right? And the sender is like who sent the message. And maybe I'll say Cam is a sender for this one. And then maybe I add that to some of these other ones. So I say sender. My co-founders or something. Right. So I can pass another prop. So now my message components have two. Some of them have two props. They have content and a sender prop defined. And if we looked at the, I got rid of that console log. But if I go back to this message component and I bring back the constructor and console log the props, you'll see that some of them have two props, right? Like this one has two props defined on it, and then others only have one prop defined on it. So you can pass multiple props into a component, and you can make use of it the same way. So here I'm making use of this.props.content. Maybe I want to make use of this.props.sender as well. So maybe I'll say return, instead of just returning this, I could say return, make it a multi-line thing. And then I say, okay, cool. So div, I'm just gonna like make it look a little bit more formatted. So I'm gonna say this.props.content sent by, and then I'm gonna say this.props.sender. But what we'll see here is, there's some there's some stylistic things that are messed up. There's a couple of things that got messed up. One is this, I don't really want this lack of a space. And then secondly is, by adding that sent by thing in there, clearly the props that don't have a sender are still adding that to it. So that is not necessarily the best for what I want to accomplish. So what can I do instead? I probably want to do another conditional to make sure that I have this .props.sender, right? And I could do that by adding another if else condition, right? I could do that. Or I can make it so that this whole thing is kind of conditional. If I have this .props.sender, maybe I want this message to be a little bit more specific. So maybe I'll do that and just kind of make this a little bit more of a interesting kind of thing. So one of the cool things about classes, class-based components, is you could define a number of different functions inside of your class that you can use as a complement to your render class or your render function. So for instance, right now I'm kind of struggling with like whatever the logic will be for rendering my message. So maybe I'll create another helper function that I'll use to help me render the message. And just like we were talking about a while ago when we first started talking about JavaScript, there's a couple of ways you can define functions. You can define them this traditional way, with the name of the function, curly parentheses and curly braces, or you can define them as arrow functions. And that's actually what I'm going to do. I'm just going to define this as an arrow function because this syntax allows me to do a couple of things that are helpful when I'm working with class-based components, like in terms of the understanding the instance that this function is tied to. Point is, I'm just going to use arrow functions. In general, I encourage you to use arrow functions. It just makes your life a little bit easier when you're working with React. But I'm going to just make this little helper function called render message. And this function's job is going to help us render the right message string. So I'm going to say, so basically, if we have content, if this.props.content is a thing, I'm going to return, instead of returning kind of this.props.content like this, remember I said we can pass JavaScript inside of these curly braces in between the elements. I'm going to, instead of just returning this.props.content, I'm going to make use of another JavaScript object, which is this function. I'm going to say, hey, I want you to call render message, right? And render message is a specific render message is a function that I defined here. And you can see that VS Code helped me out a bit. And when you're calling another function inside of a class, you have to use the this keyword to make sure it knows what instance of this, just like we're saying this.props, we're saying, hey, inside of this instance of a message, I want you to call this render message function. So this.render message is basically saying in whatever instance of the class I'm looking at, whether I'm looking at this instance or this instance, I want to call this render message function very specifically. And so by saying I want to call this function, inside of this function now will get called. So I can say, I could do some more logic in here to help me just make more sense of what's going on. So here I have this if else block that we were working with before. If this.props.content, return a div. But now I get to say this.render message is now has to return some JSX. If this returns anything other than JSX, it won't actually do anything for me in terms of visual stuff. So I got to make sure that this function returns some JSX. So what is it going to return? That's the question. Well, remember I was saying I was struggling a little bit with this logic of, oh, if this.props.content, but also if this.props.sender existed. So I'm going to just make some logic in here for that. So I'm just going to say if this.props.sender exists, then if that's the case, then I'm going to return a very specific div that says, okay, this is going to return this.props.content sent by this.props.sender. Or if it's not, if it doesn't exist, right? If this.props.sender doesn't exist, then I'm just going to return another set of JSX. I'm just going to return maybe like this.props.content like we had before. And so now now that I'm looking at it, we kind of are creating this div ourselves here. So instead of wrapping this in a div, I'm just gonna call this dot render message as I'm gonna, what did I want to do? I'm trying to make it make sense. I'm gonna just try to make it make sense. Okay, this is what I'm gonna do. Instead of just calling this div like this, what I'm gonna do is this. I'm gonna say if this dot props dot sender, I'm just gonna create a string and have this be reflected as a string instead of have it be reflected as an element, so that the div will know. Basically, we're gonna say, hey, render this dot render message is going to determine whether or not the div is going to say this, just the name of the message, the message itself, or if the string is going to have the sender's information as well. So you'll see what I mean in a second. Basically, if this dot props dot sender exists, I'm just going to return a string that says, so I'm just going to return a new string. And in JavaScript, there's a way that we can use what we call formatted strings. So I'm gonna use these backticks. And basically the backticks are allowing me to then put JavaScript expressions into a string. So I'm gonna say, if this .props.sender exists, then I'm gonna say $ curly braces will allow me to pass some JavaScript, just other JavaScript inside of this string. So if I were creating a string and I wanted to pass some JavaScript variables or some JavaScript objects or anything inside of the string, I can do so. I can pass those variables by saying $ curly braces with inside of these inside of the backticks, and say whatever the name of the variable is. So I'm going to say this.props.message, right? Or content, my fault. This.props.content sent by, and the same thing, this.props.sender. And so that's in this case that this.props.sender exists. But if it doesn't exist, right? Like in some of those other examples, we saw that it didn't exist. So I'm just going to return this.props.content. And I actually don't need the backticks because this isn't really a formatted string. So I'm just going to just return this.props.content because this is going to be a string itself. So I only use these backticks because I wanted to pass like kind of like a formatted string, and I passed some, the sent by thing and use these as variables. But because in the condition where this.props.sender doesn't exist, all I need to do is return this.props.content. So let's just look at what's going to happen here. Render message is a function. So basically what I'm doing is inside of my render function, I'm saying, hey, this div, there's a couple conditions going on. One is the condition that this.props.content exists. And this was the one that we worked on first. So I hope that y'all are still understanding and rocking with me on why we have this condition set. It was because we wanted to check if this.props.content existed. And if it did, then we're going to say, okay, cool, we're going to return a very specific message. Otherwise, that means the user didn't pass any kind of prop in for us to use. So we're going to just put a default message in there for them, and that's going to be cool. But on some of these components, I added another prop called sender, and not all of those props have that. So not all these components have that. So I wanted to kind of make sure that I'm keeping track of if that prop exists, right? Otherwise it's undefined. If it exists, I want to have a very specific message. I want a very specific, I want this to render something very specifically. What I wanted to render is the message and who sent it. Otherwise, it's just going to render the message if there was no sender. And that's what's happening inside of here. We're saying, hey, call this.render message inside of the div. Divs as a default take text elements as divs take text elements and any other elements as children. So long as I return either text or render, or I return some JSX, the div will show it up as part of this expression here. So let's save this and see if it works. And cool, it did. So now I got passing data from props sent by Cam, another instance with props sent by Naomi, and testing on another instance sent by Cray. Seeing as those messages don't really make sense to be sent by somebody, I'm just gonna change them up. I would just say, try to say yo 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 yo. That's something I would say. And then this is cool. It's something I think my co-founder Naomi would say. And then, oh my man, Chef Cray say, he say something like, a. So when you look at this, now I kind of got this this kind of coming back with some interesting logic for those components that have the prop for specifically the prop for content, right? We see that. So for just clarity, let me take away this one. And let's say, so one of these messages won't have any props, right? And this one has a default, so this is a default message. Maybe I'll change that default message to say, this component has no props for content, right? So it just makes a little more sense. This component that got rendered has no prop for content. Some of the other ones do. All of these other ones do, and some of them have a prop for this sender, and they have a different format than this one in the middle. That is this one that says one more time. I'm going to change that to say this component has no sender prop. Well, I gotta charge my computer before I dies on me, but we almost at the end. So clearly we have a couple different versions of the same message component, right? We have one component, which is this component, and a couple of different like interesting logic is happening inside of here now, right? This is the same message component that we worked on earlier, right? All it's doing is returning a message, but now we extended it a lot more, where instead of just returning a simple string, it's returning some interesting logical scenarios. There's the scenario where you have a string defined as content, and it will render that for you as a message. Otherwise, it'll just give you a default string. But then in the rendering of the message, it checks to see if you also passed a sender prop. And if you did, it gives you a very specific kind of string to return. Otherwise, it's gonna return just the content for you. And all of that logic is being made useful inside of our component in its render function. And this is where components get a lot of their complexity from, is the passing of props, the logical solutions and scenarios that come from working with props and the data that gets passed in. And of course, being able to rebuild your component itself to handle different scenarios with data that is being passed into it from the parent component. And yeah, so now we talked a little bit more about props, and props are one way that we work with data in terms of components. There's another way that we can work with data in terms of components. The thing that makes props interesting is that we can't change a prop inside of these message components, right? I can change the prop when I first define it, and I'm passing it here, as you've seen me do multiple times today. But inside of here, I can't change this.props.content from inside of the message component, right? If I were to try to change that, I'd get an error because props, once they're inside of the component itself, they can't be changed. They're constant values. So props are data that gets passed into the component from its parent that cannot be changed by the component itself. So that makes it very interesting. It's helpful We can clearly use that data to do some interesting logical things within our component. But of course, there might be other circumstances where we might need some more data to change over time. And that's where another type of data, working with a different type of data in terms of components is useful. And that data is called state. And so when you start looking at these sections in the React docs, right, we just kind of walk through some props related things. So you'll be able to see some more about that here. Part of the thing that was blowing me earlier, which was why I was kind of like off my game when I was defining the constructor, is if we were to be defining props on a class-based component, like this hello component, for instance, in order to define props here, you pass the props like this. So if I were to you don't pass the props, but you make a reference to the props by passing this keyword props into your functional component. And then you can use, similarly, you can work with the functional component to make use of the props. The same thing holds, though, that in order to define the props, though, I need to define them from the parent component. And the parent component of my hello component is clearly my app component, is the one that renders it. So same thing, if I wanted to create props for my hello component, I would define them here. And inside of the hello component, I can make use of the props here. So let's just do one last one as just kind of the last hoorah, is inside of the app component, I'm gonna pass just a small prop real quick and just say, maybe I'll just say just the date. Maybe I'll say like the date is, and I'll pass a string and I'll just say 9/29/2021, right? And so now that I've defined a new prop inside of this component, inside of the hello component, I can make use of that prop as well. And to do so, I could do similarly, instead of using this dot props, because there's no render function here in the function, right? That was what was blowing me. So inside of the functional component, you would just be using props dot whatever the name of your props was. So inside of this particular component, maybe I'll do something like hello. Maybe I'll do the strings thing and I'll say hello. It's $props.date, right? And in doing that, then I would see this component update because I passed that prop into it. So with functional components, you just use props and you use the name of the prop that way. But with classes, it's a little bit different. You can use this syntax when you're working with like the constructor, but with the render function, you can make use of the prop very specifically with this dot props. And that's more of the common syntax that we'll see within functions that are defined as helper functions, as well as the render function itself. So only is it in the side of the constructor is the only place where you would have to pass props as the same way you do as a functional component. But yeah, just wanted to clarify that up a little bit. And you'll see as you start reading through the React docs, where it's talking about all of those things in the components and props section. So I recommend you read this because props and state are the two areas that get really tricky and confusing for people who are learning React for the first time. We're definitely going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but reading it and trying to practice this on your own. Maybe you want to create some components of your own and pass props between them. Maybe do a similar example as the one we did, or rewatch this and try to follow along as I'm working through it together. But yeah, that's really it for today. We talked about a lot. I hope that y'all get a good opportunity to look back at it. I'll make sure I put the video up when it's fully ready. And as always, I appreciate y'all for showing up and being here, and we'll talk soon.